Every time an American animated show comes out that is well received by audiences, the question eventually arises, is this an anime? Now, this is a rather odd question to ask to begin with. Generally, we only pose this question of a show or a movie if they're doing something genre-bending. Is Guardians of the Galaxy a comedy or a superhero movie? Is Star Wars science fiction or fantasy? Sometimes the answer is both, or neither. But when posed of some American cartoons, the answer is not so simple for many. Usually when people ask whether an American cartoon is an anime, they're responding usually to a feeling they get while watching the cartoon that reminds them of anime. There's something in the presentation or writing. Often the argument for a cartoon to be considered an anime is, look at the tone or seriousness of the writing, the art style, where or how it was animated, the action, or if it was Asian inspired. And of course, but it's good. None of these qualifiers on their own would make any show an anime. Just because the show takes itself seriously doesn't make it an anime. Just because an animated show isn't primarily a comedy doesn't make it an anime. Just because the show was animated in Asia or inspired by Asian animation or culture doesn't make it an anime. And of course, being a good show isn't enough to make a show an anime. If these were the case, then Arthur would be an anime. SpongeBob could be considered an anime. Fresh Off the Boat would be America's first Taiwanese sitcom instead of an American sitcom about a Taiwanese family. Now, to be fair, when people have conversations about what cartoon is an anime or not, they're usually talking about a handful of shows. A list that usually includes cartoons like Avatar: The Last Airbender, Castlevania, and Steven Universe. Now, these are well documented to have been inspired by anime, and some of the aspects of Japanese animation or storytelling that they utilize are done very well. However, the fact that they are made by and for Western audiences is disqualifying for them in that category, as animation is generally categorized by where it's made. Western countries' animation, including Canada and Europe, are considered cartoons, while animation made in Eastern countries, specifically East Asia, including South Korea, and of course Japanese animation, is considered anime. Yet it isn't merely where an animated show was produced that determines whether it is inherently an anime or not, even though it has something to do with it. The more essential determining factor has more to do with the nuances of a foundational cultural ethic and an emotive style that Western animation has yet to achieve or adopt from Eastern animation. Persuasive appeal is used when people construct arguments for the purpose of convincing an audience of something. These persuasive or rhetorical appeals, coined by Aristotle, are known as ethos, an appeal to ethics and credibility, logos, an appeal to logic and reason, and pathos, an appeal to emotion or feelings. These same rhetorical appeals can be applied to all media generally, but here specifically to creative media. The reason being, all media has authorial intent and persuasive elements. When you see a show or watch a movie, the authors and showrunners want you to think or feel something specific, from the music they use, to the style of animation, to the writing and dialogue. Anime and cartoons, therefore, both utilize these three persuasive appeals. However, they do so very differently, which is why most cartoons aren't placed into the same category as anime, or anime-inspired for that matter. Yet, for the few cartoons that people like to consider anime, there are some similarities. These similarities fall primarily into the category of logos. Anime-inspired or Asian-inspired cartoons follow a similar logic as anime. There's a main character who has to beat the odds, save their family, defy the world, stop the gods. They go through very human ups and downs that cause them to make similar choices across mediums. They take themselves seriously. There are tough topics like death and trauma. They even may do so with an anime-inspired aesthetic. People are very big on, if it looks like an anime, it must be an anime. These are all aspects of the logic of Asian animation or anime. Yet, even though some cartoons might look similar to anime or follow another aspect of anime logic, this alone doesn't make them anime. Anime and cartoons also have ethos and pathos, and this is the rub, where they differ the most. Let's look at the ethos or ethics of anime. In a traditional persuasive argument, this would be the author trying to build some type of credibility with the audience based upon their expertise or the expertise of their sources. Yet this isn't how ethos works necessarily when it comes to television shows and creative media like this. Yes, showrunners spend a lot of time in development researching how to make a movie or show authentic or culturally accurate. This is ethos. And yet, no one has ever accused a Pixar film of being an anime. And furthermore, when Asian countries like Japan attempt to make stories that are inspired by the Americas or other foreign places to Asia, a similar amount of research is necessary. So even though Japan has a higher level of credibility when it comes to Asian stories, the US has more credibility when it comes to American stories. So we can't merely look at the level of external authority. We have to look inside of the text, or at what's in the actual show and review what aspects of this program would signify to the viewer that they're watching an anime and not a cartoon, or vice versa. Because creative media doesn't attempt to inform the viewer of how much research they had to do inside the text. So the question is, what amounts to an anime's credibility? When you describe the ethos of anime, we have to look at the cultural ethic or customs of Asian content that shines through the characters or the anime overall. This is a textual analysis of the show itself and the story's characters' attitudes and the show's treatment of other film or literary devices. For as similar to anime in some aspects of ethos that some anime-inspired content is, there are some key differences between the ethic of most anime-inspired content and actual anime. Asian culture is one aspect that Asian-inspired cartoons get right. Through meticulous research, many anime-inspired cartoons successfully portray the imagery, customs, and philosophies of Asian cultures. However, anime differs from cartoons in the way in which the characters and the show interacts with these elements. Let's look at food, for instance. Food and food culture is very different in the West, particularly in the Americas, than it is in the East. An American and a Japanese show can both show a banquet of food, and yet they describe them in very different ways. American food culture is very different than Japanese food culture. Although America has rich food traditions stemming from America's various ethnic communities primarily, its celebration and entertainment media almost exclusively centers fast food dining experiences and snacks.
What do you have?
Flaming Fireflakes. Best in town.
I'll take them.
Hire another slice of the cheese, Robin?
Thanks, Robin. Got room for another one, Robin?
Don't mind if I do, Robin.
No way! It can't be! Do you want to try some special new French fries? Do I?
As barbecue, like fast food, is a very casual food experience and technically the only distinctly American culinary tradition outside of fast food. Anime, on the other hand, prioritizes home cooking experiences, unique dishes, and the intersection of nutrition and health. Anime spends significantly more screen time describing food experiences, what it means to the characters, and how unique flavors taste and feel to those characters.
肉の脂身はとろーり溶けるまで煮込み、ベソースと絡める。綿の苦みが食欲をそそり、濃厚な味が疲れた体に生気を。
This is the curry of life. This is just so delectable. A myriad of flavors. The spices are blended to perfection.
Hold on a sec.
The village hidden in the leaves is more than just a hop, skip, and a jump away, you know. I've whipped up a special batch that'll give you 10,000 times the strength you'll need for the journey.
Ugh, that's the reddest curry I've ever seen in my life.
これが本物のコロッケってやつか。それに中身、男爵の身に混ざっているこの茶色いのは。
Very little time is spent on the experience of food in Western animation. Western cartoons tend to describe food in very nondescript, simplistic terms like good and awesome or cheesy. This is one way to clearly discern the difference between a cartoon and an anime. Food is also used narratively in anime more often to illustrate what's happening in the narrative and what the characters are feeling, from what they eat to why they eat, as a tool to emote. Come to think of it, food-related anime are kind of its own genre of anime. When cartoons use food for the same purposes, the focus is placed on the experience of the meal rather than the food in the meal. The experience of gathering to eat with people who are dear to you for occasions like a birthday dinner, Thanksgiving, or Christmas is used in cartoons more often as a film device than the quality, look, flavor, or production of the actual food items or dishes. The focus is generally placed on whether the gathering occurred, did we get to it, rather than whether the characters ate a particular dish and what that dish signified. So food is one way in which anime differs from cartoons. If you pay attention to the use of food in these mediums, you'll be able to see a clear difference between how they're used. And this difference between fast food and unique dining, the meal or the dish, is evident even in Asian-inspired cartoons. One of a few ways in which cartoons just aren't anime. Anime ethos has a disparate ethic when it comes to both gender expression and sexual orientation or codified sexuality than in Western animation or cartoons. Although the arc of inclusion in media over the decades exists in both domains as they have both improved and evolved, the history of this type of representation in both Western and Eastern cultures are quite different. Japanese culture has had a long history of including varying gender or sexual identities in their comics or manga and in their animation dating back to even before the 1970s. This can be found in one of their first depictions, the 1967 anime Princess Knight, written by Osamu Tezuka, about a princess who took on male traits to become a warrior, adapted from an even earlier manga of the same name. Furthermore, women having both masculine and feminine traits is also found in much of Eastern history and texts, as in the Ballad of Mulan from China, and in the history of the Onimusha woman who fought alongside male samurai. Female warriors as a class, or women who occupied male spaces, appeared in many places in Eastern historical culture in places like China, Korea, and Japan, but doesn't have a formal equivalent in European or Western European or Western history, despite the odd figure like an Anbani, the female pirate, or a female ruler. Depictions of varying gender expressions, bolstered by historical representations, eventually evolved into more overt representations of gender and sexual differences in anime, as well as in the anime genres of yaoi, boy love, or yuri, girl love, and their westernized monikers that don't feature explicit sexual encounters, shoujo-ai and shonen-ai, respectively. Western animation has had very little variance of gender or sexual representation throughout its history until around the post-millennial age. Western culture is steeped in the Judeo-Christian ethic and has been oppressive of both femininity and same-sex romantic attraction. Readings of biblical texts through a literalist and culturally dominant lens have led to both sexist and homophobic interpretations to proliferate. Some modern theologians have worked to unravel some of these ideas, but many of these ideas, like the equivalency that modern terms like homosexual are given to ancient scriptural terms and context surrounding same-sex thousands of years ago have persisted. Even historical depictions of women taking on male traits in the name of faith were met with violence, evident in the real-life case of the heroine and warrior Joan of Arc, who was burned at the stake for numerous charges, including heresy as well as the crime of dressing like a man. Pre-modern depictions of women in leadership in defiance of gender roles or aesthetic identity seem to be nearly void in Western history, and certainly to the Western cultural memory or active consciousness, particularly in reference to the church. Not to mention in men whose more genteel gendered clothing seemed not to press too hard on societal norms of the time in the case of the fop. Moreover, male femininity is equally elusive outside of the histories of ancient Greece or Rome. Asian or Eastern cultures have had a much longer history of varying gender and sexual expressions. The conflation of sex and sexuality only exists as a modern concept. Men could have wives and have male trysts or lovers without them considering themselves gay or lesbian, similar to the conception of sex and sexuality in ancient Greece. Therefore, these depictions of gender and sexual oppression in Western history didn't translate into many earnest attempts to include gender or sexual variance in much of cartoon media history. Early depictions of women taking on male roles, as in battling or leadership in animation, also coded these same female characters as highly feminine or hypersexualized, as in the case of She-Ra and other female cartoons that emerged in the 1980s. Outside of other gendered stereotypes for female characters, depictions of female characters were usually very feminine in early cartoons, and male characters generally did not stray outside of masculinity. Eastern faith traditions, particularly those found in Japan, namely Shinto and Buddhism, are apparently less culturally concerned with the manifestations of gender and sexuality. Shinto, for example, prioritizes cleanliness in terms of sexuality and sexual activity, as does Christianity, yet has viewed homosexuality as more taboo or unnatural, as it doesn't serve the inherent biological purpose or instinct of procreation, but doesn't describe it in such bombastic terms as it is often described casually in Western faith traditions, despite its very limited existence in the actual scriptures. Additionally, the Shinto encourages the social and religious utility of women as spiritual leaders, more so than in Western religions, despite the separate roles men and women play in both Eastern and Western society. This includes the ordination of women into roles in Buddhist and Shinto traditions. Contrarily, the roles that women play in biblical scripture and ancient Israelite culture, which are less clearly defined in terms of the roles women play in the actual religion and outside of their relationship to men, and that relationship being subservient and submissive in and outside of marriage, is furthermore more often interpreted as religious principle rather than a cultural practice of the time. Most formal female roles in Western faith traditions are still subservient to male roles, as in Catholicism, and many Protestant faith traditions continue to push back on the canonization of female leadership in the church and pulpit, despite their modern existence in sister faith traditions, like in the case of the female rabbi and female pastor, even though these two have faced contention, particularly in the diasporic Judeo-Christian faith traditions of the West. Summarily, in the Judeo-Christian landscape of the West, particularly the United States, this has led to very conservative depictions of gender expression and sexuality in Western animation. And since most Western animation is made for children or adolescents, it is hard to get more varying depictions past censors. Anime hasn't been very much suppressed in that realm by Eastern religiosity, and builds nuanced narratives, and has played with the reality of same-sex attraction and gender expression for decades. Even for anime made for very young demographics of children, there are little qualms about displaying non-heteronormative depictions of characters.
You've got this ripped body, but such a delicate face to go with it.
What? Why are you obsessed with my face all of a sudden?
In fact, the girlish shape, size, and complexion are quite attractive.
You're a dead man! You wanna go?
Some female characters may be more masculine or even taller than boys. Some boys may be thinner than girl characters, may have higher voices, or look more like females, which many young boys do, especially before puberty. They may even have an inclination for feminine colors or activities like cleaning or baking. Most cartoons don't have these depictions. In fact, there is a history of Western media censoring both homosexuality and non-heteronormative characters in the English dubs of some anime. The archetypal nerd character is often as far away from heteronormativity that most Western censors have allowed cartoons. Tomboys are usually as far away from heteronormativity that girls get. And that tomboy will usually have a huge secret heterosexual crush in cartoons. Boy characters won't generally have female traits, like long hair. Girl characters won't have male traits. Codified sexuality does have a history in cartoons with foppish or feminine male characters, or masculine female characters. But these characters have a history of being written as villains and antagonists to the main characters. There have even been some depictions of these gay codified characters to be likened to the actual devil or demons. And these characters, these effeminate or masculine gay codified characters, were written so that they are not meant to be trusted or admired. Modern, often Asian-inspired cartoons have attempted to canonize homosexuality in some newer animated shows, but they largely either rely on extratextual analysis, with showrunners announcing that a character was gay all along as a post-mortem for a finished series, or playing with the hinted romance among female characters rather than male characters, which is by and large how homosexuality is portrayed in cartoons when it is to be taken seriously. Often due to women being viewed as less sexual than men and a safer choice to display on screen, shows like Steven Universe have included canonized depictions of female-female relationships for characters they insist are agendered and non-binary, but are also exclusively female. So there is comparatively more female LGBT representation than male in Western animation at the moment. And the depictions of male representation in kids' media depict the male characters in very much heteronormative ways. And this points to a general difference between cartoons and anime. Cartoons generally shy away from representing gay culture. Gayness isn't merely an attraction that must be represented in the form of a relationship. It is also a culture which often has an observable communication style, fashion, viewpoint, and mannerisms. Most Western representations in animation are with heteronormative characters. They don't seem gay. You can't tell unless they tell you, or they end up in a relationship, not often representing gay culture or varying gender expressions.
You should know something.
You like me as a friend?
Yes, because I'm gay.
Oh.
With very few outliers unless the show is for adults, and generally representing their homosexuality through the canonization of a relationship, which is by and large how Western showrunners have responded to social movements pushing for more representation. Anime, on the other hand, much more often does represent gay culture through varying gender expressions, flamboyant characters with different ways of talking and dressing. Additionally, anime in general, when it comes to romantic relationships, heterosexual or otherwise, doesn't tend to focus on putting characters in obvious, clear-cut relationships. There is a courting that takes place in anime that can last a whole series, if not just the season. The characters will blush, do nice things for one another, admit their feelings at some point, support each other emotionally, hold each other, but rarely do they ever do things like kiss or make blatant declarations about who is or isn't their boyfriend or girlfriend in the middle of a series, or at all. Many anime will have time skips where that courtship has already evolved and culminated in a kid or a marriage without ever seeing the couple kiss or declare their relationship. Anime or Eastern sensibilities save more overt displays of sexuality like kissing for genres that are for adults or those that focus on romance. Cartoons and anime-inspired content almost go out of their way to make characters an official item. Western animation and Western media in general being far more focused on who's hooked up with who or linked to whom. Additionally, if you research gay cartoon characters whose representation has grown a lot in recent years for Western animation, you'll find that, and it is important to note, that 75% of these characters are minor characters. They aren't main characters, the show isn't about them, so their representation doesn't get developed. You'll often see representation in the form of parents of characters, side characters, and often one-off episodes rather than main characters whose identities and relationships have an arc over the course of a season. In this way, anime can easily be distinguished from cartoons by their treatment of homosexuality as well as non-sexual gender expression, even among the Asian-inspired cartoon sect. Anime has more gender expression diversity. Cartoons have recently begun to canonize same-sex relationships, possibly more often even than an anime, but lacks the more nuanced scenes of the impetus of those relationships, which start with a simple crush, acts of service, or focusing on the reciprocation of feelings. In anime, both gender and sexuality is more up to the interpretation of the viewer because relationships and preference is less blatantly defined than in cartoon content. Eastern animation audiences can relate to characters that represent something authentic and natural about themselves without having to feel beheld to cultural norms, labels, titles, or the false idea that their attractions and possibly lack of either femininity or masculinity are indicative of some inherent sexual orientation or gender identity. And although late to LGBT representation, evident in their lack of diverse gender expression, particularly for non-LGBT characters, Western animation focuses on and succeeds at overt depictions of relationships. Another way in which cartoons and anime differ. Anime differs in some key ways from Western animation when it comes to the nature of the relationships that are presented on screen. Western media tends to focus upon romantic or sexual relationships depending on the primary demographic of the audience as key motivating factors for the characters. This translates in cartoons to main characters that are looking to find romance as the principal or most important interpersonal relationship that a character can achieve. Anime, on the other hand, prioritizes friendship as key motivating factors for the things characters do, and the most important type of relationship. Now, this isn't to say that cartoons aren't about friendship and anime doesn't have plenty of romance, because it does, but the treatment of these elements in each medium is quite different. Before we continue, let's talk briefly about fan service. Anime can have much more sexual fan service than is seen in cartoons. It is a trope in Japanese animation. In fact, there are a plethora of anime-specific and cartoon-specific tropes that will be touched upon in this series. Now, this fan service can be viewed as pointing to some type of romantic or sexual preponderancy in anime. However, if we review both mediums, cartoons and anime, intertextually, anime spends far more time showing, explaining, and building the significance of friendships over romance than in cartoons. Even for anime that predominantly features romance, there is far more parity between the level of time spent developing friendships versus romances. Time is spent with characters learning to like each other. Time is spent with characters confessing what one means to the other as a friend. You'll see depictions of characters thanking each other for who they are and how they've helped them, explaining each other's strengths and weaknesses. You'll see them go through difficult trials together by growing closer. They'll cry over one another. This can occur in conjunction with a burgeoning romance, but usually romance is something that is achieved by one character through a confession after a culmination of auspicious encounters when one character will bump into her crush, or one character actively trying to help another character through some difficult trial or examination in life. Not something the narrative actively spends time developing, unless the anime is of the romantic genre. Cartoons, on the other hand, spend far less time describing or showing the importance or meaning of the characters' friendships. Friendship is always implied in cartoons by characters spending time together or through adventure rather than saying it. They usually don't ever discuss between characters why they're glad they're friends beyond announcing they're friends or becoming part of the unit. Characters don't have an internal dialogue about the significance of their friends. Characters may get in arguments, which are resolved with minor confessions of apology, maybe a hug. They may express loneliness without their friends, but friendship in cartoons are rarely things that are given development or have an arc, for example, in the ways that they spend time on romance and characters' feelings toward their attractions and how those feelings translate into actions.
So Tornado built this android to party. Not how he'd put it, but yeah, more or less.
Entertaining.
What you got it?
Ooh. Look, they are dancing.
Yo! A crazy man poisoned me, and now I can't dress myself, or cook for myself, or do anything for myself. And this whole time, my friends have been off helping the world while I'm stuck with you, and you can't even heal me!
Mermista, lipstick. Ew, do you know what that stuff is made of? I'll be this knife.
I feel like perfume should be the perfume bottle. That makes the most logical sense.
Maybe I could be a flower.
Could I be this miniature painted model of Bo?
No!
You're back!
Oh, you know it! Now let's go destroy something else! I don't even care what it is!
This is the extent of cartoon friendships. They spend time, but the characters rarely verbalize their feelings toward their peers, while when a significant other is presented, they begin mulling over them. Anime, on the other hand, really goes deep with friendships. They spend far more time describing friendships than romance.
You know what else I think? Deep down, you're a smiley, fun, super cheerful guy.
Were you trying to tell us that you like heroes? Was that it? Well, 'cause I like them too. They're so awesome.
You talked to me when no one else would. And I remember thinking how warm you were, how bright. You were shining.
君は僕に似ているんだ。僕も体と個性が合ってないんだ。以前から似てると思ってたんだ。サプライズは嬉しいだろ？僕はサプライズが何よりも嬉しいのさ。僕が嬉しいと思うことをしたのさ。どうだい？チーズ美味しかったかい？
あれ食べる勇気ないよ。ありがとう。サプライズ大成功だよ、青山くん。や
った俺の勝ち。何言ってんだ、俺の方が早かっただろ。よーいドン。
Because we're friends. Do you hear me, Gon?
I can't help him anymore.
戦いがあったというもんだ。褒めていただいてるぞ。
一生ものよ。
だってさ、ムサ、一生ものだって。ムサ。
ムサなら断れないと踏みやがった。
ユキ先輩も一緒に走りましょ
う。無理。俺には俺の時間が必要なの。
ニコちゃん先輩は？
朝夕だけで十分。
そうだぞ。いたわれ年寄りを。
自己紹介して。はい。篠本明穂です。よろしくお願いします。このこといろいろ教えてあげてね。あと日直や入るのは来週。可愛い方ですね。
In popular anime-inspired cartoons, the parity between friendship and romance is far less equitable in the description of or development of those themes, leaning more heavily toward romance. There is no becoming of friends in a cartoon like there is a becoming for romances that may take many episodes to evolve. Now granted, there really isn't a romance genre of cartoons in Western animation, but this is what we have. Cartoons tend to establish the intensity or significance of friendships through time spent around each other, usefulness in battle in the action genre, cracking jokes, overcoming a disagreement, and more recently in anime-inspired cartoons like The Legend of Korra or She-Ra, confessions of trauma. But rarely do these heart-to-hearts have anything to do with the platonic peer, nor do the characters articulate the positive feelings that they may have for that character. It is merely implied. In Avatar: The Last Airbender, an Asian-inspired program for instance, we know little about Aang's feelings toward his friends Sokka, Toph, and Suki, other than his decision to call them friends and the times the program shows them having fun together or looking out for one another. In fact, the platonic relationship that Aang spends the most time describing or showing affection toward is Appa, and he's a flying bison. Zuko has the longest friendship arc in the series, but we never see Aang or any of the characters declare or indicate their platonic affections for Zuko in any way. He simply went from an untrusted character to a trusted character who is now part of the unit. Same could be said of Korra and her strictly platonic friendships. And this is true of most American animation. They don't have internal conversations about their friends, i.e., I'm so glad he's my friend. She's so awesome or amazing. They're always there for me. As an exception, Steven Universe did a pretty good job with this. However, his friend group also basically raised him, so it kind of doesn't count. In short, anime and cartoons, when it comes to romance and friendship, they have show and tell. In cartoons, there is some show and little tell when it comes to friendships. Anime has big show and big tell. In romances, cartoons have big show and big tell, relative their depiction of friendship. While in anime, in the non-romantic genres of anime, of course, we have little show and some tell relative their depictions of friendship. This reality is a complex one. Why doesn't Western animation portray friendship in equally nuanced, meaningful ways as the East's anime? Why don't the characters tell each other why they care about each other? Why don't they cry over one another? This reality may stem from a difference in the cultural ethic of the West and the East. Friendship in Asian cultures seem to be in media depictions of friendship as more of a virtuous character trait, which may be why it is represented so frequently in anime. Romantic attractions are inherently more mature and emotionally complex, which in many ways make them unsuitable for programming made for kids and adolescents. But romantic attractions are also inherently more selfish and individualistic than friendships. Friendship doesn't normally have a sexual component, therefore there is less of a priority on the needs of one party over the other at times, and are essentially more altruistic. Additionally, it makes sense to have more depictions of friendship because over the course of a lifetime, anyone will have exponentially more friendships than romantic partners. Western culture may de-emphasize friendships in their writings because of Western individualism and American exceptionalism. One of the main tenets of Western cultural ethic is the belief that an individual can reach their highest potential on their own. They can have all that they desire if they work hard and they're a good person and they know the right people. Often the highest form of this ethic is represented through the obtaining of a great job, a big house, and yes, a significant other, actualizing the one true love fantasy which is often sold to children in Western media. This is individualism. This ideology lends itself to placing a high importance on romance as a man or woman's greatest interpersonal achievement and less importance on friendships because they're less about the individual and more about the collective, outside of the volume of friendships that a person can acquire, which can be seen as a symbol of high status in Western society. While Asian cultures are more collectivistic, meaning the whole is more important than the individual. This lends itself to more close, more exclusive groups of friends where affections are more apparent and intimate, as some social research has indicated about friendships in Asian cultures. Even the highest form of Western virtue, the Christian faith, has bended to this type of individualistic framework. This video is essentially about different types of love, friendship, and romance. And love in the original Greek of the Bible was at least 3 different words, eros, philos, and agape, which in the original King James Bible was translated into 2 different words, love and charity. Charity meaning acts of service, affection through giving. It has a more altruistic and unconditional meaning and is inherently a more virtuous and godly form of love. That's translated from the word agape. However, nearly all, probably all, later and recent translations of the Bible have translated that word into love. And that's an issue when the same term love is used in the Bible conflating eros love, a physical, sexual, and romantic type of love, with agape, a sacrificial and divine type of love, when they're intended to be 2 different words. No wonder people are confused. No wonder Western cartoons have an issue portraying intimate, brotherly, familiar, or platonic love as in philos, when people relate love with, well, romance and sex. There is even somewhat of a trend in anime-inspired animation that when 2 platonic characters, often of the same sex, become too close or affectionate in their friendship, the showrunners make them gay, which is fine in its own way, but also somewhat suggests that platonic affections cannot run that deep. The more you learn about the topic, really, the weirder the phrase making love is. On the other hand, Japanese and other Asian languages don't really use the term love, if they have a term for it at all. These cultures may have many other terms to describe feelings of affection or romance toward others, particularly of platonic affections. And possibly as a result, they do have more nuanced depictions in anime of these kinds of more virtuous love, i.e., friendship. The ability to show deep friendship in cartoons or anime, for that matter, in a meaningful way doesn't make any program either good or bad. Nor does it mean romance is inherently more important than friendship, or vice versa. But it is telling why people flock to anime for these kinds of depictions of friendship. Depictions that are not often seen in Western media, cartoons, or even in the Asian-inspired sect of Western animation. And that is a key difference. In this Cartoons Aren't Anime series, where we've been looking at some of the fundamental differences between Western and Eastern animation, there have been a couple of junctures at which I've mentioned religion. The reason for this is because religion and the history of religion's influence on culture and subsequently art and media is incredibly great. Great and terrible things have been done through the media in the name of religion. But we're not here to talk about all of that, really. We're going to be talking about the influence that religion, both Western religiosity and Eastern religiosity, has had on the medium of animation, how religion is portrayed in anime and cartoons, and in particular, the so-called anime-inspired cartoons. Now, the first thing that there is to note is that the Western religions and Eastern religions that we'll be discussing are Christianity and Judaism, and therefore Judeo-Christian values, that come from the West, as well as Eastern religions like Shinto and Buddhism, the primary religions practiced in Japan, where the majority of anime comes from, and Buddhism in particular being found in much of the East generally. These religions have played an important role in the development of culture and in the course of history in the West and East, respectively. But as broad waves of globalization began to take place over the course of the 20th century, beginning around the time of World War I and the advent of commercial flights and the stabilization of global commodities, continuing through the proliferation of the World Wide Web, the influences of Western religions began to get a foothold in Eastern society. Resultantly, Western religious influences can be found in Eastern media and anime. Similarly, Eastern religious influences can be found in Western media and animation as well, seen especially in the last 20 years as anime and Asian-inspired content began to grow in popularity in Western media. Eastern religiosity can be found in just about every popular anime that you come across, from depictions of temples to home shrines. It can be seen even more broadly in anime in the discussion of religious ideologies, values, and their implications on characters, even when any type of formal religion isn't presented. The primary Japanese religions of Shinto and Buddhism are very well documented in anime, particularly anime who place their stories in feudal Japan, when the shogunate or Bakufu, and by extension Buddhism, had a heavy influence on daily life.
You're the great Master Roshi, right?
People tell me that.
Master, my name's Krillin, and I've come all the way from a village in the east. Please allow me to be your humble student and learn to fight like you.
Well...
These depictions have long been a part of anime over the years in some capacity, and they continue to be. Yet not only is Eastern religiosity a part of the anime landscape, Western religions, i.e. Christianity, and to a peripheral extent, Judaism, have made themselves present over the course of globalization, particularly in the post-millennial age. These depictions can be described as overt depictions of Western religious imagery, Christian allusion, overt characterization of characters with Christian themes and paraphernalia, and Judeo-Christian allegory.
People are crying out to God for salvation night and day, but you angels can't be bothered to show up.
Now, but 2 hills over, another village is being marauded by evil men. 8 innocent slumped charred on stakes, burned by men of the church. Why do you not save them?
Why don't you?
There is a prescribed order to the world, an order you flout.
間に合ってよかった。
間に合った。
地上スレスレでキャッチできたから死なないで済んだ。
これを。
から特急生きる希望をあげる。
希望？
生きる希望。
Now, outside of Eastern animation, depictions of religious or faith traditions are very far and few between. There isn't really a graceful way of saying this, but no respectful comparison can be made between Eastern and Western religious representation, because religious representation doesn't really have a presence in Western animation, especially in today's market. Christianity and Judaism have played a pivotal role in the construction of what is seen as the West: colonialism, manifest destiny, slavery, the influence of the Pope, the Church of England, the Crusades, television censorship, the Civil Rights Movement, Religion's influence on every aspect of the American government, despite the existence of the separation of church and state, from swearing in on the Bible to the dollar, to the fact that every U.S. president has been at least culturally Christian, is a manifestation of the influence that Christianity and Judaism has had on the West. In truth, Western faith traditions don't have any concrete representation in Western animation, even while religion is embedded in so many aspects of Western culture and history. There are, however, some long-lasting tropes and properties that continue to make some allusion to Christianity and Judaism, many of which come from decades-old properties, and they're worth mentioning.
And lo, the angel of the Lord came upon them, and the glory of the Lord shone round about them. And they were sore afraid. And the angel said unto them, Fear not.
Baboons to the left of me, baboons to the right. The speeding locomotive tore through a sea of inhuman fangs. A third came screaming at me.
I don't understand. I am the God of your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You shall do my wonders.
We come bearing gifts! See? Mold!
I brought francs and cents!
And fur!
Well, this image certainly has the Christmas spirit.
Tommy, if that new king catches us with our old books, we're gonna get in a lot of trouble.
I don't care, Chucky. These are the books our forefathers read, and our 5 fathers, and our 6 fathers, and I'm not stopping now.
These types of religious representations in Western media first appeared in early animation and continued steadily through the 90s and into the early 2000s, in the case of the holiday special and a special program. Yet these appearances were also comparatively sparse. However, as the 2010s began, there became a growing secularization of Western animation. Fewer and fewer depictions of religion or faith traditions or even religious or spiritual characters have appeared, particularly in animation made for children. Characters don't display any religious belonging or display any sort of pious character trait that might allude to the existence of religion or God. And the Christmas or holiday special isn't what it used to be. And when they do have them, they are nearly completely devoid of Christian overtones. It is actually really hard to find any reference to the religious in Western animation now, outside of the one character who announces that they're ethnically Jewish, which is less about religion and more about culture, a trope that has been in more recent media extended to characters of Muslim descent, but generally don't have a large presence because representations of Islamic traditions are very rare, considering people who practice Islam are arguably more dogmatic and evident in their practices than Christians or Jewish people. So if they're not going to show Christians in cartoons, they surely aren't jumping to show Muslims in animation. So much for diversity. The majority of modern depictions of religion in Western animation have been relegated to adult cartoons, which are exclusively comical and satirical, like Reverend Lovejoy from The Simpsons or the Jesus character from South Park. In these cases, the devout are often played for jokes, and more adult conversations over the purpose and validity of religion are had, which are always presented from a cynical point of view because the shows are comedies. There doesn't seem to be any depiction of the earnestness of religion or the inner ponderancy of religious principles or values, which used to be a mainstay of kids' cartoons' depictions of religion. In fact, the most overt references to Christianity that I've seen in any mainstream kids' cartoon in the last 10 years was in Illumination's The Grinch movie. They sang a bunch of religious Christmas songs, almost exclusively even, which was awkward because they didn't mention religion in the movie at all outside of those songs, really. This contrasts very greatly from Eastern animation, where because of the influence that spirituality has on Eastern culture, it is regularly represented in anime. which makes the lack of religious adaptation in anime-inspired cartoons that much more apparent. Anime-inspired cartoons or animation tends to lean heavily on the individualistic and secular values of Western culture. Generally, they approach spirituality and religion in two different ways. First, anime-inspired cartoons tend to downplay or mess over Eastern religious philosophy. We can see this in the Avatar universe. Of the 4 nations, the air nomads were the only prominently spiritually inclined culture in the world. Once they were destroyed, not only was the Avatar universe's world cut off from a part of the world that was inherently more spiritual, but the audience was cut off from a potential adaptation of that spirituality. It only existed thereafter in the form of Aang and the spiritual practices that he continued, his virtues, and his connection to the spirit world, the spirits he and his friends met, as well as in the few other characters that displayed some type of spirituality in what was an animated universe that was, because of the Fire Nation, increasingly secular. Now, spirituality was in this case downplayed because of that narrative choice, but I will say that Avatar did a beautiful job in the ways in which it did choose to approach spirituality. However, when they went to The Legend of Korra, depictions of spirituality changed from a nuanced but downplayed spirituality to pretty messed over. The Legend of Korra really didn't know what they were doing when it came to the depictions of spirituality or religion in the series. Take Tenzin, who was supposed to be Aang's spiritual predecessor. He followed the practices of the air nomads, but his entire demeanor seemed to be divorced from the spiritual ideology of the air nomad. Character-wise, he was wise, but quick to anger, and in his training of Korra, he seemed to be more concerned with her adherence to airbending practices rather than their spiritual ideology. He didn't seem to have the same spiritual diplomacy of Aang even when Aang was a child, and seemed to be more of the world than Aang ever was. In fact, Zahir, in his characterization, although twisted and deranged, seemed to play more to the religious discipline of the air nomads than Tenzin, even though Tenzin was taught directly by Aang, an actual air nomad. It was as if Tenzin was an air nomad practitioner, but not a monk, treating the education of new airbenders more like a boot camp than a spiritual pilgrimage, when being an air nomad was a lifelong faith system that's based in communal living and vows of selflessness. In fact, in Korra, airbending leaders were self-described as airbending masters rather than monks, the way Aang described himself, his peers, and the titles given to the leaders of the air nomad people. I mean, Aang was a master bender, but he knew when to retreat, to submit, and when to fight, because he was also a monk. There's a reason why the last remnants of Monkiatsu were seen sitting, because it is very believable that a monk would surrender in a life or death situation when fighting would be fruitless. Yes, Tenzin's lack of spirituality was a plot point in the Legend of Korra series, but it is still worth mentioning. Furthermore, the rest of the spirituality in the show was kind of messed over too. Janora's spirituality was treated like chosen one magic rather than spiritual knowledge and discipline like the nomads or Iroh, who achieved a connection with the spirit world. The spirits were changed from mysterious and esoteric creatures of otherworldly knowledge and form to basically Pokemon. The entire harmonic convergence arc has nothing to do with Eastern religiosity and is more related to the Western study of astrology and spiritualism, and the whole Rava versus Vatu plot point is more Western good versus evil binary religiosity. Heaven kite versus hell kite. Nothing to do with Eastern spiritualism. At least not essentially. See? Messed over. Secondly, it is important to acknowledge a more modern anti-religious approach to the representation of religion, which appears most often in anime-inspired cartoons. Religion and religious people are depicted as blindly religious zealots and/or blatantly evil cultists. The Masters of the Universe show depicted their only organized religious organization as an evil cult. Castlevania did as well. In the show, the church was a bunch of bigoted, patriarchal, arrogant fools that burned an innocent woman at the stake, or a cult. Sypha was a part of a tribe of nomadic, monk-like magician characters, but she constantly made a point of saying how irreligious she was, and her people being essentially witches. Yasuke did the same thing with their villain, who was a demonic Catholic priest. This is a very common trope in recent anime-inspired Western animation, especially that which is geared toward older teens to adults. Religion or religious people are probably depicted as evil. Other than this, most anime-inspired cartoons don't represent religion at all. Star vs. the Forces of Evil? Nope. Besides this character design, a monk that can heal. She-Ra? Nope. Steven Universe? Nope. Aside from this scene. Kipo? No, not really. In truth, despite the stark difference between the representation of religion in Eastern animation versus Western animation, there is no clear reason why this difference exists. According to the Pew Research Center, 70% of Americans have some sort of Christian affiliation. Another 6% are affiliated with other major religions, which is pretty consistent with other Western countries. According to Helen Hardacre, a Harvard University professor, only about 60% of Japanese citizens practice some type of religion, which is comparable to most European nations. So, what is the reason why the practice of religion or spirituality is so much more often represented in Eastern animation than Western? In the West, this could be because no one would be satisfied by any representation. The American evangelical community seems to be hyper aware of the types of religious representation represented in media meant for children. Many Western animators may be wary of representing major religions in ways that might attract the ire of these communities, some of which have a lot of political and social power. Historically, this may be the reason that there has always been sparing representations of religion in animation. However, the steep decline in religious representation in Western animation can probably be ascribed to the growing secularization of America and, by extension, of animation showrunners. The number of religiously unaffiliated Americans have doubled since the 90s, according to The Atlantic. Resultantly, we see in Western animation either religious marginalization or anti-religious sentiments promulgated through anime-inspired animation, which is ironic to say because anime has a much more balanced approach to religious representation. The modern criticism of organized religion having less to do with the existence of a higher power, but rather more to do with the practices and beliefs of evangelicals who are viewed as oppressive and bigoted toward both women and LGBT individuals, and their unwillingness in many of these religious groups or denominations to engage meaningfully with these topics. Many Western animation showrunners lean left very hard politically, and not that this would inherently make you anti-religious, but there is an increasing representation of both women and LGBT individuals in animation. Instead, what we see in Western animation is allusion to Judeo-Christian values without actually acknowledging where their ideas or beliefs come from. A kind of secular religion, in a way that the characters sometimes acknowledge or espouse religious values while being as secular as possible, representing these ideas as coming from some deep personal epiphany. This would explain why Western animation doesn't depict religion favorably, if at all. Yet it doesn't explain why Eastern animation depicts religion as often as they do, and why Western anime-inspired media refuses to adapt the religious sentiments of the East. As I've mentioned, the religious affiliation of the East is very similar to the religious affiliation in the West. In fact, Japan itself has had a history of religious prohibition. There were feudal prohibitions on Christianity, compulsory Buddhist temple affiliation at that time, as well as a wave of modern anti-organized religion sentiments following the Aum Shinrikyo Tokyo metro attack that happened in the 90s. Yet, the reason for both why Eastern animation still depicts religious iconography and themes, and why it is so hard to adapt for Western animators is because of the idea of collectivism versus individualism, a concept that we touched upon before in this series. Despite growing secularism and anti-religious sentiments, Eastern countries, and Japan in particular, value religion and spirituality as an important social aspect of their culture. According to Helen Hardacre, social and religious values emerge. The character of affiliation tends to be customary, based on location, family, and community, more than on religious conviction. And even though Christian practices and traditions in Japan place more of an emphasis and energy into religious convictions, time, and teaching, as it does in the West, than there is with Buddhist or Shinto practices, we can see that spiritual devotion is represented favorably in anime as an honorable spiritual aspiration that most may not have the discipline to achieve. Western individualism would suggest that this form of collective spirituality doesn't provide enough social autonomy for an individual to live and believe the way that they want and reach their highest potential on their own, which is essentially the American dream philosophy. And therefore, they choose a more idiomatic moral relativism, which at its worst creates a lot of virtue signaling in Western animation, aside from marginalizing religious representation. Anime does a good job of representing religion. They'll depict religion from the West and from the East from an apolitical perspective. Anime does represent cults and hypocritical religious zealots and all that is perverse about organized religion, but also represents what is aspirational, honorable, and blessed that comes from a connection to a higher power and faith. On the other hand, Western animation has had a sharp decline in its depictions of Western religions, as well as some hostility towards representing religion at all in any meaningful way. So the question is, can one truly be anime inspired if they're unwilling to acknowledge the social impact of religion on culture and the meaning that spirituality has in the lives of millions of people across the globe in animation? The answer to this isn't quite apparent, but concerning the realm of religion, because this contrast between Western animation and anime exists, it is easy to discern the difference between them. Now, I'd like to talk about how authorial credibility or reliability is affected by fan service for a second as a part of the ethos of animation. Fan service being the intentional inclusion of content to please the audience. Oftentimes, when it comes to any program we consume, you'll see that the program can grow to follow the social trends of the time. They'll include more diverse characters. They'll have storylines that follow current social movements, and dialogue will become more reflective of popular speech used in media or social media. And the desires and opinions of fans propagated on social media will find themselves in subsequent seasons of a series. It is a dubious trend, but it isn't inherently bad in and of itself to address popular culture in animation. But it becomes problematic when it undermines the integrity of a program, when it contradicts the initial vision of that program, or the values to which the story itself or the showrunners attest. You'll find this ethic in both Western and Eastern animation, but how it manifests in both mediums, anime and cartoons, is rather different. Anime usually follows a very strict set of rules and guidelines when it comes to the storylines and portrayals that they depict in their shows. Not often do you see an anime follow any social trends as they progress from season to season that would obviously change the tone or quality of the show in any major way. Anime often have a lot of checks and balances on their storylines. Much of anime are also manga adaptations and have chapters and chapters of source material to draw from rather than from pop culture. The process generally for an anime to be produced is actually quite rigorous and competitive, and most likely even more so for anime that haven't been vetted by beginning as a manga. Therefore, whenever an anime follows a social trend, it is usually an intentional decision by a showrunner at the beginning of the series. You won't often see any abrupt changes in the quality or tone of an anime series between seasons or even in a spin-off series. If an anime is about sexy fan service, you'll probably see that all the way through the anime. If the anime is about Japanese urban style and speech, sexuality, specific fighting or animation styles, or social justice, you can bet that this will be a theme from the beginning. Drastic changes in tone or style or in the themes from season to season in an anime are probably an indication that there were serious production issues taking place. American media, and by extension cartoons on the other hand, are historically quite responsive to the whims of pop culture. From the genie in Aladdin to the world of Gumball to Glee, Western media have a pop culture ethos that makes it almost a requirement to reference something socially relevant in studios. For example, The Wonder Years was a show many watched growing up about a 1960s family. Very nice, very nostalgic show. But 2021 brought a small reboot starring a black cast. Great cast, but I couldn't help but wonder, watching, who this was for, because it was as if they distilled Modern Family and injected the pop culture into a 1960s black family in Alabama and called it The Wonder Years. In only the first 5 episodes, they managed to make the mom a sexually liberated pseudo-feminist and easily offended at microaggressions for some reason. The daughter was a pro-black activist of sorts, and the dad was a musician. All things the average black family in the 1960s in Alabama were not. Now, I don't think the show is irredeemable, but by my estimate, it's about 25% actual black culture, 25% Wonder Years nostalgia, and 50% pop culture agenda. And this type of fan service is very common in mainstream television in the West. And animation is not immune to this, even for the anime-inspired ilk. Here are some examples of cartoon fan service in its many forms.
But when's that?
He'll never see it coming. Unfortunately, neither will your face.
You have made yourself a slave to this place.
Right. I love you.
I love you too.
Is that better?
Oh, hey!
Well, class is my big sister.
Let's do this!
And rude.
And bored of this.
Unduplicate.
Invincible.
Mister, you're back in the...
And shows like Avatar: The Last Airbender and Ruby have fallen prey to the sway of the pop culture tide as well. As consistent as Avatar: The Last Airbender was in its storytelling, The Legend of Korra, its sequel series, was full of pop references, including themes related to social justice, the whitewashing and Americanization of much of its setting and storytelling, and the reduction of its animation quality, and the insertion of LGBT themes. Ruby followed this same trend, bending to the will of their fandom with ships and storylines that resulted in wildly inconsistent character development. This type of fan service doesn't have a presence in anime. Anime rarely, if ever, follows trends or the whims of the audience or pop culture. And generally speaking, when fan service is discussed concerning anime, we're generally talking about something very different.
あえつじさんの構えを正しい形に変えるんだ。
まさかここまでとは。
私の全身バイブでマッサージしてやっからお仕置きしてください。さ好きなだけぶってください。
犯人はじいさんか。おどうした夏。
まずは熱を測ってやろうか。それとも注射がいい。
All of that's in play, but not a single fan service event! I haven't run into a shorty in the hallway and accidentally pet her sweater kittens! I haven't bumped into a hottie around the corner and gotten a peek at her undercarriage!
For anime, fan service usually comes in the form of sexual fan service between characters. Characters fall on each other, panty shots of female characters, male characters losing their clothes during a scene for no reason. This type of fan service, this sexual fan service, differs from the shipping fan service that is seen usually in cartoons, usually anime-inspired cartoons. In anime, shipping has an in-universe implication on the plot, so it is used very sparingly. In anime, sexual fan service rarely has any implications on the relationships between the characters or the plot. It's just something to tease the audience. Someone does something sexy, someone else gets embarrassed, the audience blushes, then it's over. The characters involved don't necessarily or even usually have or will have romantic relationships. Anime fan service has become contentious among some groups of people, particularly in the West, who find it exploitative, but fans of anime generally accept it as part of the medium for anime geared toward older teens and young adults, and not children. It may seem that the descriptions we've reviewed about Western and Eastern fan service may seem less critical of the Eastern sexual variety of fan service. Although many find it offensive and some anime overuse it, it wouldn't be academically honest to dissect its existence in a way that suggests any inherent ramifications of it. That's not evident. And the reality is it's not even exclusive to women. Men get it too, depending on the anime we're talking about. Yet the primary reason why Western fan service is more problematic, particularly for Western audiences, is because of narrative credibility, the concept mentioned earlier in this video. Western animation prioritizes a type of writing that encourages writers and showrunners to insert mainstream political agenda into animation to drive engagement from viewers. Often this occurs in their depiction of female leads, the narrative prioritization of shipping, and the inclusion of LGBT themes in the series. On face value, none of these ideas represented in animation are bad, and all of them have been visible in various anime throughout the years. However, the way in which these themes are addressed in cartoons is what problematizes them for the viewer. Fan service for female leads in cartoons have resulted in the emasculation of male characters, stripping them of their utility in the narrative and, at times, creating in the female character the Mary Sue trope, a female character that is unnaturally lucky and has no flaws, while at times also making that female lead aggressive and unlikable. LGBT themes are often addressed haphazardly, either teasing the audience with scenes that don't substantialize their identities or over-legitimizing their identities by forcing that character into romantic relationships as if to virtue signal to the audience and to other characters that these relationships are equal, rather than focusing on how their identities make them unique and interesting characters first. Shipping culture often creates very distracting subplots that stall the progression of the overarching plot for the sake of narratives that often make characters' motivations seem frivolous or immature as they are romantically linked with characters for no apparent narrative purpose. Now, many people actually enjoy these choices, but they often split fandoms, as general viewers find it off-putting as showrunners shape the narrative to pander to the voices of people in social media, rather than just making a competent program. This often produces in viewers a sense that the show lacks credibility and is unreliable because the choices made in the plot are viewed as pandering to mainstream culture rather than natural ones that flow logically throughout the narrative from writers and characters. Viewers shouldn't have to pull back from scenes constantly asking themselves, since when is this character gay? Why is this character an activist? All of a sudden, this character had lifelong PTSD? How does this character find so many romantic partners when they're so unlikable? Anime don't generally have this problem because of the level of vetting that takes place before and during production. Furthermore, when an anime has fan service, it usually is just an aspect of the show from the beginning and not something shoehorned into the series based upon social media responses. Fan service is quite a conundrum at this time for the West. It's generally more expensive to make animations in the West than in the East, and the anime ecosystem is much more vast than cartoons, so that if you don't like one show, it's easy to find another one in short order. Most of the vitriol concerning Western fan service and animation is probably related to the fact that there aren't enough cartoons to satisfy the demand for them. So for the ones that are produced that meet an individual's particular demographic requirements, it's frustrating for these shows to also be drowning in pop culture and political agenda. And yet, fan service isn't going anywhere for anyone. So what Western showrunners need to understand about the viewer is that ultimately, the audience wants a show or story that they can trust has a vision, has strong writing, and isn't subject to mandates that will ultimately undermine the quality of the program. The system of focus groups, of network mandates that is so common in the Hollywood system is a barrier to establishing the level of confidence in the audience that people generally have with anime. People like anime because there are way more of them than cartoons, and they're usually of much higher quality in animation and storytelling. There is room, however, for the West to establish a system where programs are vetted for quality, and if one program doesn't work for you, there are other options in cartoons that can meet your needs. So fan service isn't a problem or a distraction. Otherwise, you'll hear this fairly common refrain. That's why I watch anime. Another aspect of anime's rhetorical identity that differs greatly from that of cartoons and therefore anime-inspired cartoons is pathos. Pathos is the way in which a show emotes, or the feelings they attempt to portray and therefore persuade you to feel as a viewer. Many who watch anime and then anime-inspired cartoons would point to the feelings these cartoons give them as a reason to consider them anime, or anime-like. These programs can make you feel happy, sad, excited, hopeful, and even afraid. They utilize a variety of film devices that support the overall feeling viewers get from animation, like lighting and cinematography, music, the art style, the animation style, dialogue, and voice acting, to great effect. All of these, in addition to the actual plot of the show, add to the overall feeling one can get from any show, animated or otherwise. However, anime differentiates itself from cartoons in some very key ways, most notably of which is catharsis. Catharsis is defined as the purification or purgation of the emotions, such as pity and fear, primarily through art, or the purification or purgation that brings about spiritual renewal, or release from tension. Anime and anime-inspired cartoons provide the viewer a unique kind of catharsis through its action, dialogue, and scenes. Through action, both anime and cartoons elicit catharsis in some very similar ways through well-choreographed, explosive action that provides a release of excitement. Even cartoonish violence can elicit a type of catharsis. They are also similar in how they establish looming threats and villains that cause you to fear. These moments leave you with a sense of relief and satisfaction.
マナロケットパンチ不届きお前が悪の親玉かブラックデバイダー
Yet when it comes to the catharsis that causes a release of sadness or pity, the mediums diverge. It is very possible that some anime-inspired cartoons or cartoons in general have been produced in such a way that it has caused someone to feel something like catharsis and cry, but not me. In fact, if there exists a portion of the internet where people emote or cry going in cold to a cartoon they've never seen and weren't already fans of, they're definitely not very visible. For sure, Pixar will make you cry, but when it comes to TV shows, they rarely, if ever, elicit that deep of a response, with, I'm sure, some very rare exceptions. When it comes to the ways in which anime and cartoons attempt to depict sadness, while one's methods are clearly more effective overall.
It's too dangerous.
I'm one of the Leaf's legendary Sanin. You know what that means just as well as I do.
Well, hello there. I'm Jiraiya. You can send love letters later. Nice to meet ya.
You stupid fool.
そんな気持ちで殺してはいけません。落ち着いて、笑顔で。
さようなら。コロ先生。
はい。さようなら。
道しるべ桜思いあふれわかってるけど
手紙読んだぞ。俺も大好きだぜ、メンマ。
私も大好きよ。俺も大好き。
俺ももちろん大好きだ。
Two, right? I have to do this. This is my destiny. Oh, Adora. No. This is not it. But this is the only way to fix things. Do you want to know a secret? Care of each other.
She's just a child. You have me. You won, okay? You just heal her. You have that power. Please, Salamene, come back. Come back.
Kipo. It's really you. Oh, I can hug you. I can't believe you're here.
I can't believe I'm here either.
Anime tends to provide more build-up to the expressions of sadness and despair that they portray with careful dialogue about what the characters are feeling, the instrumentals that inspire sadness, with slow scenes that linger on particular nuances of sadness like the weather or an empty glass, the lighting of a scene for instance. Anime will show the context of the character's emotions well up for a significant length of time at the expense of additional story beats. This is a very effective way of eliciting catharsis, because in an episode of about 22 minutes in length, if the objective is emotion, it isn't necessary to hit every action, story thread, or element that normally would take place in an episode, like familiar comedic beats, or even main characters whose arcs are unrelated to the content of that episode. Cartoons, on the other hand, have a tendency to display feelings of sadness in a far more abbreviated manner. In fact, crying in general in cartoons is far more rare than in anime. If they cry, it tends to be 1 or 2 tears only. The scene will be only a couple of seconds long with minimal dialogue explaining their feelings. Instead, the audience must interpret the characters' feelings more, and the characters will rarely sound as if they're crying. Almost as if the actors were directed to sound sad rather than cry, and the tears were added in post. Often these scenes are also truncated by unnecessary exposition. This happens in a twofold fashion. Not only are they telling you why the characters are sad instead of showing you how sad the characters are, and also because generally they don't slow down the plot to address emotive scenes, and will leave emotive scenes to hit more story beats. This happens in a twofold fashion. Not only are they telling you why the characters are sad instead of showing you how sad the characters are, but also, generally, they don't slow down the plot to address the emotive scenes. They will leave emotive scenes early to hit more story beats.
I know you're frustrated, but...
Of course I'm frustrated! A crazy man poisoned me, and now I can't dress myself, or cook for myself, or do anything for myself. And this whole time, my friends have been off helping the world while I'm stuck with you, and you can't even heal me!
Look at these 2 scenes of animation.
I've been humiliated. Humiliated! Me? Envy? Jealous of you? Of you humans? I'm a homunculus! How could this pipsqueak kid see through me? It's the ultimate humiliation!
The expression of sadness in the cartoon is actually quite short in comparison to the anime. There is also a lot more going on from a filmmaking stance in the anime example, and this is more or less indicative of what you can expect from this type of catharsis in anime and cartoons. Now, cartoons are improving dramatically in some areas of animation, like in Arcane and Castlevania, who are some of the only Western animated programs that get even close to this aesthetic, in this area and in general filmmaking. But the quality of an Arcane isn't the norm at this point, while it generally is in anime. With sadness and catharsis, anime spends time in scenes to develop character motivations and dialogue. Cartoons trend towards story beats. Something happens in a cartoon that's sad, the characters react to that thing. If they cry, it's for 1 to 3 seconds, and then they move on to the next beat. Same thing with other displays of character building emotive scenes, like desperation or anger. Anime just does them better in a way that one might find in a live action motion picture. A pathos that doesn't translate well into Western animation at this point. Cartoons as they exist, with their often G-rated level of emotion, generally aren't without their charm, however. Due to the Disneyfication of much of the Western animation ethos, the ways in which cartoons express pathos is also aligned with this aesthetic. Cartoons have the tendency to emote through the use of show tunes, a style that hasn't been replicated in anime, even for the musical genre of anime. It's a pathos that says, I won't show you how I feel, but I can sing it to you. Anime, on the other hand, uses music as dressing to well-developed scenes and storytelling. Many cartoons use musical-style showstoppers full of singing and also dancing in lieu of building emotive scenes to express emotion. Kristen Chenoweth, a renowned Broadway actress, describes this aesthetic as such. We sing because we can't speak anymore. This speaks to a pathos that insists that words fail, so music is the closest expression to that emotion. Dance is the closest expression to that emotion. This style of pathos can be very moving. Yet it may be less likely to inspire catharsis because it can pull the viewer out of the diegesis of the cartoon, quite different than a well-written, well-acted scene. But still, this Western cultural musical theater pathos has great appeal, can bring about tears when well done, and is cathartic in its own way. This is something that anime hasn't replicated. There are musical shows, but it's not very often used, and it is also more geared towards primary grade children. Another part of the pathos that anime and cartoons build is related to the stories and narratives that they use to tap into the emotional experiences of the audience. The best way to get someone to feel or understand your feelings is by relating to the feelings and experiences that they already have. In Western animation, many of the storylines that are written to elicit some type of emotional response from the audience are related to Western topics like race, urban life, culture, and superheroes. Social justice subject matter is a large part of the new media landscape in the United States and many other Western countries. Western audiences are very familiar with these topics and subsequently the thoughts and emotions attached to them, which is why many cartoons use these subjects as a medium to emote, and generally more often than Eastern animation. Anime, however, comes from a part of the world where there is comparatively greater levels of cultural and racial homogeneity. Anime tends to focus on stories and narratives that are more character-driven. Thematically, most anime focus on more esoteric or abstract concepts that lend themselves to internal conflicts rather than external ones that are related to social justice, for instance. External conflicts in anime might be related more to universal conflicts and themes of money, media, and power rather than cultural matters. Issues of gender, race, or sexuality are generally concepts that characters confront in anime internally or on a character-by-character basis, rather than something that protagonists have to address within the world, their community, or on a systematic level. In the vast landscape of anime, there are many anime that deal with these social elements in similar ways as cartoons, especially the anime-inspired cartoons that are produced today, but generally they focus on more human stories. The pathos of anime appeals to humanity, which often requires the deconstruction of society, but more often individual human themes of personal identity, religious principles, personal codes of ethics, and ontological and existential questions of who we are or how we should live within the condition of being human. Anime's pathos inspires deep inner thought and reflection. Anime-inspired cartoons do address internal themes such as these, but more characteristically tend to externalize these themes, which dilutes the emotional impact of the story because it's less of a personal problem or even an interpersonal problem for the characters, and more of a societal or community issue. Summarily, anime makes you cry more. Anime and cartoons differ as they exist now on some fundamental levels of pathos. The way anime constructs emotive scenes that produce catharsis in action or in sad scenes is far more sophisticated in general than what is produced in cartoons, with the exception of some newer productions. Yet the showtune style of catharsis is something generally unique to Western animation and is quite effective when done properly. Both have their appeal. However, whether emoting through scenes of action, tears, or music, cartoons and anime just aren't the same. In this series, we've been reviewing a lot of what makes anime and cartoons different. I've tried to be judicious about the ways in which I've discussed this topic as to not sound spiteful towards cartoons. I love cartoons, and among my top favorite animated shows, some of them probably aren't even anime. The primary concern of this series is deconstructing the tendency of some to conflate the two mediums. As an anime lover, I only began to prefer anime content when I grew up and needed something a little bit more narratively and emotionally complex than hugging. So even though in many ways anime are more sophisticated than cartoons, There are also some ways in which they perform equally well and don't differentiate, like in the realm of music or scoring. However, there is one area that not only has no real equivalent in anime, but also is executed on a much higher level in Western animation, and that is in the realm of comedy, and specifically satire. Satire is an aspect of comedy, a genre of expression that appeals to humor, which is part of pathos. Both Western and Eastern animation cater to comedy in their programming. In fact, the oldest animated programs used humor as their primary purposes and tonal appeals. So it's fitting that this tradition would be included as a hallmark of animation as a medium. And there have been many different types of comedies for both Western and Eastern animation. Ones that are for children.
This is exactly what non-violence leads to!
Comedy that is geared for adolescents.
You just hang in there, Mayu. You're going to be okay.
And comedy that is suited best for adults.
Morty!
Now, generally speaking, Western animation tends to have more surreal or absurdist humor. Types of humor that are more unexpected or avant-garde. They don't have to necessarily be in alignment with the situational logic of each episode. Teen Titans Go could be an example of this, or for adults, Rick and Morty. And although shows like The Simpsons have surreal elements, their comedy is generally grounded in the logic of each episode. These shows fall into the parody category.
And now back to Roundtable.
These zoning laws are infringing on the rights of citizens.
If I might interrupt for a minute, I'd like to point out
You've had your time, let someone else speak.
I haven't said a word, it was that guy.
Don't look at me, I can't get a word in edgewise. Well, then who the hell's been talking this whole time?
Stranded? What's that?
Stranded was a show about people marooned on a mysterious island that's riddled with religious and scientific paradoxes.
Well, islands are always entertaining. From Gilligan to Iwo Jima. Wait a minute. That flashback raised more questions than it answered.
This parody category is something that anime does equally well.
You wish to defile me, don't you?
What?
What shall I do, Kazuma?
How should I know?
I can feel his filthy eyes on me. Hungry, wanting. They are the eyes of a degenerate, one who would make a sex slave of me. Oh, the horror! What should I do, Kazuma?
Still don't know.
Drowning in inch-deep water isn't easy. I know that, bud.
Saiki, hi! I couldn't help but notice you look sad. Perfect. Now he has a memory of me to cherish for the rest of his life. I bet you've fallen in love. That's okay. Even though we're on separate social levels, it's a natural response to my beauty. How else are you supposed to react to perfection?
On the other hand, despite anime's use of parody, anime's humor is more often situational or character-driven. Characters have certain quirks or traits that make them funny. You can expect them to say or do a range of things based upon their personalities. The humor doesn't generally bend reality or appear to be incongruent with the logic of the show. Yet satire is an aspect of the comedy genre that is important to acknowledge because it plays an important role in Western culture, a role that doesn't have an equivalency for Eastern culture, and is therefore why satire exists in anime to a much lesser extent. Satire is a way of using humor to show that someone or something is foolish, weak, or bad. Humor that shows the weakness or bad qualities of a person, government, or society. Satire as a medium of literature and drama is centuries old. It was a mainstay of Greek playwrights as well as the European writers that emerged later on, particularly those in the 16th century around the time when satire entered the English language. Parody, which is a common type of comedy in both Western and Eastern animation, a comedy that is about imitation and comic ridicule, is closely related to satire, if not a direct ancestor of it. The difference being is parody doesn't necessarily point to some moral failing. They're often conflated. The West does have a lot of programs that are strictly parody, but parody and satire are quite different. In the original form of satire, as in the Greek, the art form was used to poke fun at the faulty nature of our human understanding. Lysistrata was a famous Greek play about women who withheld sex from men to convince them to end the Peloponnesian War. It satirizes the motives behind a war that needed to end, as well as the differences between men and women. Satire continues even through Shakespeare, and contemporarily you might look to Netflix's Don't Look Up, a satire of the vain, avarice, and corrupt nature of America's political and popular culture, suggesting that it would potentially end the world, giving the impending destruction of Earth via comet. Western satire can be seen also in political cartoons, poetry, faux news websites like The Onion, and in television. Yet while satire is deeply ingrained in Western culture, Japan's and the East generally, and their use of satire doesn't have as long of a history. There were some instances of satire through politically themed art and graffiti in Japan, as well as in commentary and in some writings. But as a culture, satire hasn't been or evolved into anything as sophisticated as what is seen in the West with plays, motion pictures, and art. In fact, some of our most visible comedy is satirical in the West. This differs from in Japan, where satire is rather a growing movement. This reality is very evident in animation.
Lisa Berger asked you out and you call her fat? Do you have any idea how you made her feel? Well, Kim Kardashian is skinny and she just had a baby. This is a fantasy, you moron! You ever heard of Photoshop? Kim Kardashian is a short, overweight woman who manipulates her image and makes average girls feel horrible about themselves.
Political party might be considered extremely leftist by some.
Do you love America?
Sorry?
Why can't liberals ever answer that question with a simple yes? Say you love America right now. Say it.
Philosophy is.
Say it!
Sir, I will not be.
Say it or shut up! We'll be back with more fair and balanced coverage.
He just hit him.
No! You'll pay for this one. Class, despite my moral outrage, the school principal is allowing you to celebrate Valentine's Day this year.
I'm gonna be honest with you. You look insanely good. Like Billy Crystal at a Clippers game.
That's exactly what I was going for.
In this series, we've discussed the ways in which Japan and anime does address quite readily and with finesse the various aspects of human error and drama with nuance and artistry. But these depictions have very little to no comedic value, so they can't be considered satire. They're better described as dramas or tragedies. Furthermore, satire historically has been more useful to Western society. Satire is purposeful in pointing out the error in human ways as a society. It is reasonably assumed that Eastern society, being far more homogeneous both racially and culturally, has less use for the medium and potentially less access to it based upon the social ramifications of engaging in it in the East, which is still a concern of Japanese comedians, particularly for politically driven satire. The West, on the other hand, is far more stratified on every level. It is also far more democratic historically and contemporarily, Greece being the birthplace of both democracy and satire itself. The West's colonial history created disparities all across the world, and in an unparalleled fashion. Resultantly, the West, and particularly America, is the most racially, culturally, and religiously diverse country on the planet. It is also the most powerful. All of these numerous intersections of power, money, and culture have created a lot of corruption and chaos. Therefore, satire has been a useful medium in pointing out the corruption of either morality or power. It has been useful in holding a mirror up to the West that it might examine its values. Particularly, it is useful in animation. Some of the West's most thoughtful and engaging animations have been satire. South Park is satire. Invader Zim is satirical. Big Mouth has satirical elements. Other shows like The Simpsons or BoJack Horseman fall under the realm of parody, but often their parody points out some type of inconsistency within the zeitgeist. Satire tells us what we might be doing wrong, where our thinking is distorted, and where in life we've become too arrogant, all through humor. Something anime's comedy doesn't capture nearly as readily. So ultimately, when it comes to the mediums of anime and cartoons, it isn't correct to say that anime is ultimately better, as if suggesting that cartoons don't provide something meaningful to culture, either the culture of the West or that of the world. It does. It has been very good at pointing out the failings of our society, and it is important to keep that tradition. We cannot allow shows like South Park or The World of Gumball to disappear. Animation and satire, animation and parody give us a chance to gain perspective and reflect in sometimes a more potent way upon who we are as a people and how far we've come. It keeps us from believing the dangerous notion that our outgroup identities make us immune to human nature. Something anime does well, but something cartoons address in comedy on a deeper level. In another way, cartoons and anime differ. So in this Cartoons Aren't Anime series, we've touched upon most of the primary ways in which anime differentiates itself from cartoons and vice versa. However, even though we've talked about why cartoons aren't anime, we haven't talked about why people who like anime don't like it when you call cartoons anime. And this is especially true for people who prefer anime to cartoons in all aspects. They can hate it. And I'm not exactly one of these people. However, I made this series because yes, I don't necessarily like it. And I will preface this by saying it's usually in the media where I hear this, but I digress. I feel this not because cartoons aren't good to watch, but because they're completely different on some fundamental levels, which we've reviewed in the series. It's like calling a moped a motocross bike. Sure, I like them both, and they're types of motorcycles, but what's wrong with you? They're completely different. So let's unpack why saying this is an anime feels like such a fraught statement. Firstly, the quality of the animation is very different. Now, no, I don't mean that cartoons aren't of high quality or production value. What I'm saying is that anime, regardless of how much money is put into it, makes much better use of the visual medium than cartoons do overall. There are some anime with very crappy budgets that can't animate really dynamic action scenes. However, what they do use visually is utilized in a much more effective way. In cartoons, you tend to get a lot of wide-angle shots with static images of characters that is very boring to look at. In anime, they make use of close-ups way more often. They focus on the scenery way more often as well. They pan through shots instead of keeping the camera still to make things more interesting. Anime just know filmmaking on a deeper level. If every cartoon was shot like a Pixar movie, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But we get a lot of this. A bunch of characters cluttered into a shot for no reason, even when they're not speaking. Also, concerning the quality of the animation, there's a misconception that all anime looks the same. These are all anime. All anime doesn't look remotely like this. Most anime come from the mind of a specific artist. That artist will have their own style. Similar to how most cartoons have unique art styles that are easily discernible. But every time someone wants to compare a cartoon to an anime, they say, look at the art style, it's an anime. How? Most anime look different, and most of the cartoons that people like to suggest are anime have nearly identical art styles. Every shonen, for instance, looks completely different. Not to mention they have very different animation styles as well. One Piece action doesn't look like Naruto action, doesn't look like My Hero Academia action, doesn't look like Demon Slayer action. The one thing I can say about the Avatar universe, even though its quality turned down in Korra, is that I always could tell I was watching an Avatar scene because the art and animation is so unique. The next thing is the complexity of the ideas depicted on screen, and I suppose this is related to how seriously they take the audience. Every moral lesson in anime is not dulled down by the veneer of comedy, which most cartoons are, by either that or a very weird pseudo-morality around being adorkable, as if being awkward and non-threatening has something to do with morality. This idea of morality is related to another reason why people hate when cartoons are called anime. Some people don't enjoy Western morality, tropes, or storytelling. We've reviewed this somewhat in the Pathos videos, and the Cartoons Aren't Anime series, but essentially Western narratives tend to be about characters being accepted or helping the little guy like a superhero, social justice issues, believing in yourself, while Eastern animation tends to be about understanding your path, taking personal responsibility, trusting in friendship, growing, and getting better as a person, not necessarily or always strength-wise either, and generally more internal struggles, while Western animation tends to externalize conflicts or arcs. Not that cartoons or anime don't dabble in the other ideas, this is just in general. You may be saying to yourself, this is kind of subjective. How can you tell? Well, I'm not suggesting that everyone's, let's say, anime radar is as acute as mine, but let me give you an example. I was watching the Pokemon official YouTube channel. They make fun animations on it. I like to watch. Some are available on the Japanese Pokemon YouTube channel, and different ones are on the English Pokemon YouTube channel because of localization. But they're usually always Pokemon products from Japan. One day I decided to watch this new animated short on the English Pokemon channel about Bidoof. It looked like they put a lot of work into the animation, so I said, let's try it. I watched it, an animation with completely no words at all, aside from Pokemon using their names, and I thought, this isn't an anime. Why did I think this? Pokemon is a Japanese company, so surely everything on their YouTube channel would be an anime, whether it's in English or not. Well, the story was completely Western. Bidoof was an outcast because he was weird and adorable. He admired the cool Pokemon and trainers, so he went with them. He still couldn't use cool moves and was still a Bidoof that loses at Pokemon battles. But in the end, he fights a powerful Pokemon and wins using the basic moves he already knew, telling the viewer, you were good enough all along. That is a Western story if I've ever heard one. The adorable outcast, the never being good enough, the I was good all along, the whoa, awkward scenes they put in the animation over and over again. And guess what? I was right. It wasn't an anime. It was written by Western writers and produced by a Western producer. And when I looked to see if the same short was on the Japanese Pokemon YouTube channel, it wasn't. And it wasn't because it was made for Western audiences by Western writers. Japanese people don't write those kind of narratives in general, and they don't teach those lessons in general. And even though there was no reason not to air it on the Japanese Pokemon YouTube channel at the same time because it had no words, they didn't release it for several weeks after it aired on the English channel. Now, the messaging in this short was very Western. You are good enough the way you are. That won't vibe with people who like anime or Eastern morality necessarily because that's not even generally true. And Japan doesn't usually teach that lesson. No one is good enough the way they are. Everyone could probably be kinder or smarter or more fit or harder working in life. Instead of showing an arc about Bidoof working hard, learning something new, or even doing the same old tricks even better than before, Bidoof's arc was about believing in himself. Not very anime at all. But this leads to the question of how you know you're watching anime or not. Obviously, there are a lot of deep fakes like these out and about, especially as Western productions start collaborating more and more with Eastern properties and Japanese studios. It isn't quite clear, but what is clear is that Japanese writers and studios are standing firm in many ways about what makes their medium and culture authentic, and have pushed back at some forms of Western localization and blatant censorship, which is good for anime lovers. If you want to be able to tell the difference between anime and cartoons that look like anime, well, here's the easiest way to figure that out. Look at the original voice acting language. If it's in Japanese, it's an anime. If it's in English, it's not. Look at the producers and writers. If you see a bunch of Western names, it's not an anime. It doesn't matter how it looks or where it was animated. The West outsources an abundance of its labor anyway. Why should it surprise you that Western animation is outsourced to make cartoons? One example of this is the Star Wars Vision series, a Western property made in Japan. Yes, the executive producers were Western, but the local producer was Japanese. So was the writing staff and animators. It is safe to say that this is an anime. Ruby Ice Queendom, another good example. Western property, but a series being written and produced by the Japanese. This also will be an anime, while its origins were not. That Bidoof production was not an anime, and you can probably call it a cartoon. If you checked for the original dub language, the writers and producers, it is very easy to see whether what you're getting is an anime or not, if you're not sure. Everything else, I like to call AI. AI isn't just artificial intelligence. AI, in terms of Western animation, is anime-inspired, or maybe American interpretation, or American ideal. Any choice is fine, really. Call it Amerime for all I care. It's just not anime. Nonetheless, these shows look or even feel like anime at times, but are clearly Western animations. So let's go down a list. This is AI, 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 this is AI. Or you can just call them cartoons, which they are. Western animations are cartoons. There's nothing wrong with that term. People just don't like it often because it's associated with kids or seen as immature. But anime is anime in Japan, whether it's for toddlers or adults. So this pretty much sums up why some people hate for cartoons to be called anime, and vice versa for that matter. But honestly, call it what you want. It's mostly inconsequential. But it's important to note that they aren't remotely the same, and beyond that, based upon where the show originated, calling similar products the same is just not an accurate statement. Western animation has done its best to approach the fandom and zeal that many have for anime. If you take a wide look at the landscape of Western animation over the past 10 years or so, we've seen a number of Western shows that have followed the tropes of the most popular anime, namely shoujo and shonen anime, to capture the enthusiasm of their audiences. It has been well documented in recent years that when it comes to animation consumption, and even more so for comic consumption, Japanese and Eastern productions have taken the lead in the marketplace, with the exception of Hollywood blockbusters. However, it may surprise you to know that within the Western animation ecosystem, concerning shows that have been elevated as groundbreaking, those that many would argue are anime, there is a show lacking any sort of apparent recognition, somewhat older, that better fits the definition of anime than arguably the majority of the programs that fall into the anime-inspired category. That show is Hey Arnold. I'm sure most would wonder, how could Hey Arnold possibly be considered an anime? Well, if you'd allow, I will paint that very picture for you. Hey Arnold was a show about a boy named Arnold who had a mystically football-shaped head that lived in a metropolitan city. He goes about his daily life in school, hanging with his best friend Gerald and other friends, and just interacting with a collection of friendly and not so friendly, unique and unusual city folk. He lives in a boarding house with his grandparents and an assortment of kooky boarders from various walks of life. Most episodes are spent with Arnold facing various problems in his school, home, or community while interacting with and often coming to the aid of the vast array of characters in his surroundings. Learning from them, teaching them, helping them find solutions to problems, or just bending his ear. Now, where's the anime in the show? Let me continue. Hey Arnold also has its own brand of action and magic. There's an episode when Arnold learns karate to face a bully. He had to learn restraint and self-control in that episode. In another, there's a ghost from a haunted train. A little magic. There's also mystery. Most notably in the series, the mystery of Arnold's parents' disappearance. A mystery that came to its conclusion in the 2017 movie Hey Arnold Jungle Movie, which featured a type of quasi-mysticism. Now, you may be saying to yourself, now I see, I get the anime comparison. But let me continue. Hey Arnold was actually animated in an Eastern studio called Hongying Animation Company Limited in Jiangsu, China. Is it coming together now? Hey Arnold was an anime. It was a slice of life. Slice of life is a genre of animation coined generally for anime that explores the mundane and ordinary. It takes the typical, almost boring paths that people take throughout their day or week and paints with new colors the things that most would find undeserving of any consideration. Sitting through class, commuting to work, shopping, waiting for a bus. The slice of life unfolds the quiet beauty and valuable lessons of such moments. Moments that represent the vast majority of life. The moments in between birthdays, holidays, vacations, and graduations. Sometimes slice of life shows are comedies, sometimes they're more drama, sometimes they're more romantic, but they always illustrate the usual in ways that make it seem unfamiliar, in ways that remind us that even in what we know well, there are still things to learn. Hey Arnold had a unique ability to do this. Hey Arnold would take the most unassuming characters in our daily lives and make them foreign, verging on alien. The ice cream man that comes down the street is now the Jolly Alley Man, a manic, child-hating rage monster. Your doting grandmother is a lovable but batty old woman who has transcended senility with a lunacy that causes her to invoke innumerable past lives. You live with a bachelor that works in demolition and would like nothing more to do in his spare time than writing poetry when he isn't destroying things. But it isn't only. How Hey Arnold explores how these typically ordinary characters can be turned on their heads that makes this a slice of life. Hey Arnold shines most when the show slows down to tell the most esoteric stories of the human experience. In one scene, Arnold helps an older boy with a reading disability regain his confidence to leave his stoop.
And it can't be that bad. But it is! Everybody's making fun of me! Maybe if you tried to leave the stoop, people wouldn't make fun of you. No! I can't! What if I tried to help you? It'd just be a waste of time! What do you got to lose?
In another, through the actions of Arnold and the silent sacrifice of Helga, Mr. Nguyen and his daughter are reunited at Christmas time, after being separated for over a decade in Vietnam during war times.
You had to get rid of the soldier. You were saving her life.
It took me 20 years until I could finally get out of the country. That's why I came to this city. I believe she is here somewhere, but I have not been able to find her. Can't believe it. This is my daughter.
Hello, everyone.
Arnold also consoles a recluse, who devoted his life to some of the most unlikely animals after failing to give him the help and community that he wanted for him.
They're birds. I trust them. I understand them. It's people I don't understand.
Pigeon Man. Wait. None of this would have happened if I hadn't...
Arnold, don't be sad. You've taught me that some people can be trusted. And I'll never forget that. Wherever there's a bird in need of seed, I'll be there. I just hope there's another Arnold where I go next.
For all Hey Arnold did and said about having fun and being a kid and just joking around, it was much more often a show about the mystery of life, how unusual and dissatisfying it can be, how unnatural you feel when you encounter something you're not ready for, like you're frozen at the center of the universe, or how small and loud you feel when you want something you can't have, like you've been transformed into a cicada. Hey Arnold does all of this with a whimsical and moody jazz musical scoring that organically spurs the viewer on to think more critically, juxtaposing Hey Arnold with the frenetic hum and rhythm usually associated with urban centers. Hey Arnold does this with suggestive watercolor-like textures in its animation that give each ordinary day, walking to school, eating an ice cream cone, talking to a friend, a surreal, imaginative feel. Hey Arnold does this much in the same way as the most popular anime in the slice of life genre. It is whimsical. It takes a microscope up to our more mundane moments and examines the foreign universality of them. It is fun and comedic, but it is also somber and quiet. It's character-driven, and it doesn't rely on impossible circumstances or unlikely events to capture our attention. Hey Arnold embodied much of what we find in traditional slice-of-life anime. But it isn't really an anime. For all their similarities, even for being animated by a Chinese studio, Hey Arnold isn't an anime. It's a cartoon. Neither is Hey Arnold anime inspired. And this is important to recognize because Hey Arnold represents both something that has been lost in traditional Western animation and a fallacy of the anime-inspired category. Firstly, what makes anime anime isn't action or magic. The way Western anime-inspired animation is marketed nowadays is in a way that appeals to the audience's desire for action and adventure. Some of the most impressive action scenes and displays of magic in animation have indeed come from anime over the past decade or so, but the action itself isn't anything essential to anime. What made a show, like Avatar: The Last Airbender, an anime or anime-inspired, while its contemporaries, like As Told by Ginger, not? What made The Life and Times of Juniper Lee, another contemporary, more inherently anime than The Weekenders? Anime, as we've unpacked in this series, isn't merely about action or magic or melodrama, like we see in the most popular shonen and shoujo anime series. Anime has a certain type of ethic. It has its own set of values. It has a certain perspective on society and culture and religion. It has its own style. It has its own pathos. How anime emotes is unique. How it inspires the audience to feel is unique. But most importantly, all anime aren't the same. There are a plethora of different anime types and genres like horror, comedy, action-adventure, magical girl, romantic, and even slice of life, much like how cartoons used to be. There was a time before the 2010s when cartoons, albeit not as numerous, were nearly as varied as anime. Some cartoons were for toddlers, some action or comedies for kids, some young adult, some were adult comedies, and some were about the everyday paths that we take in daily life. They were slice-of-life shows, just like Hey Arnold. Hey Arnold, in the most essential ways, represented anime and Eastern sensibilities far better than much of what people would call anime-inspired today. It was artistic, it was emotional, and slow when it needed to be. It told deep, moving stories that could bring you to tears. It represented real life and real people in all their natural and incidental diversities. The characters lived their cultures and identities. And it was fun and funny. But Hey Arnold was still just a cartoon. In the past, Western animation showrunners weren't afraid to have complex moral lessons without being sandwiched between two fight scenes, when these lessons didn't have to be sequestered to young adult content, when shows could be slow when they needed to be, when they didn't have to rely on pop culture or meld every genre into one show to check every box, when they had real diversity of life experience and not just skin color. Think about Nickelodeon's Doug, As Told by Ginger, The Weekenders, very much slice-of-life programs. By today's standards, they wouldn't even have been made. There's no action in these shows or magic. Doug had a bit of imagination, but it was much more essentially a slice of life. They were more about exploring the ordinary lives of people and giving meaning and value to those everyday occurrences. All slice-of-life anime aren't without action or magic, but much beloved anime, like March Comes Up Like a Lion, Free, Yuru Yuri, and Food Wars, are all slice-of-life anime, with no magic or fighting to speak of. Where has this genre gone for Western animation? Because we once had it. We once had shows that were character-driven, and didn't have to rely on complex world-building to have an audience. Even superhero shows of the time, like the Batman and Superman animated series, and eventually the Justice League show, and the superhero genre itself was far more character-driven than today. Both Batman and Superman were tragic heroes in their own way, one choosing to sacrifice his personal life to protect a city, and one duty-bound by his tremendous power to. Gargoyles took a twist on dark fantasy that was far more Shakespearean than any mainstream Western animation that I've seen to date. There was a time when some cartoons were more focused on telling a story than pleasing a focus group. Cartoons have been high-concept programs about life and community in the past. They didn't have to be over-reliant upon action to be good or even to be made. They didn't have to substitute well-written drama with hugging because the narratives were too focused on displays of magic. Western animation is a pale reflection of what it used to be, not because of the quality of its best content, but because of its variety. Today's showrunners are too focused on whether or not an animation has an audience before making the show that they forget that you have to cultivate the audience. Why does this need to be animated happens to be a refrain used by the gatekeepers of Western animation studios, and you see the result. Most animation today has either an action-adventure element or a supernatural element, regardless of what studio is producing it. They're bound by the veneer of comedy and forgo drama and the slow, quiet scenes necessary to experience true catharsis. They don't find value in the honest, ugly, real, mundane, tragic, messy occurrences in ordinary life. It is true that animation is expensive and it is best to make the most out of the medium. But what happens to the Dougs of this generation? Where are the As Told by Gingers, Rocket Powers, or Pepper Anns? Where are the Hey Arnolds? Cartoons aren't anime. They differ on a lot of levels, but they don't have to differ so much. Despite popular belief, there was a time in animation when there was a lot more genre diversity than there is today. When cartoons were thoughtful, hopeful, and methodical as well as funny, adventurous, and action-packed. Anime is good and cartoons are good. You can decide which you like best, but I think we'd appreciate them both more if we could remind the world that there's still a place for shows like Hey Arnold at the table.
Waiting right here.